You're listening to Defending the Algorithm, an ongoing podcast series by the law firm of Houston Harbaugh PC in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we explore how artificial intelligence is reshaping the law, legal accountability, and responsibility in the digital age. This episode is titled Filling the AI Liability Gap. Should Asimov's 3 laws be codified to permit a tort cause of action for foreseeable harm? I'm Chris Jacobs, a shareholder here at Houston Harbaugh. I focus my practice in commercial and insurance litigation, and I've recently expanded my practice to include addressing emerging issues involving AI and the law. Now, today's episode is a bit of a special one for me because it gives me an opportunity to combine 2 interests that typically don't overlap in my professional life. That's the law and literature. And in particular, it lets me talk about how ideas that first appeared in fiction decades ago are now colliding with very real questions surrounding artificial intelligence, liability, and foreseeable harm. In particular, we're going to talk about the author of Isaac Asimov, author from the 1940s, who was rather prolific. I read somewhere the other day that he wrote about 440 books. I don't purport to have read all of those books, but I did certainly read his arguably most famous works, which is the I, Robot series. It started out as a series of short stories and then expanded into novels. In particular, the theme that is completely interwoven into all 3 of his novels in the I, Robot series is the 3 Laws of Robotics. And what we're going to do today in this episode is consider how the 3 Laws of Robotics might apply to the emerging issues that we're seeing today in artificial intelligence. Chapter 1, Introduction. When Isaac Asimov, a biochemistry professor turned science fiction author, began publishing stories about robots in the 1940s, he was, though he didn't call it that, writing about artificial intelligence. His creations were not lumbering automatons of steel and wire, but synthetic minds capable of reasoning, learning, and moral judgment. In the I, Robot stories and subsequent novels, Asimov's robots processed information, interpreted human language, and confronted the ethical consequences of their decisions. In that sense, his robots were conceptually indistinguishable from what we now call AI systems. The irony, of course, is that today's so-called artificial intelligence is still far less sophisticated than Asimov's imagined machines with their what he called positronic brains. Our chatbots and generative models can emulate language and pattern recognition, but lack true self-awareness and moral reasoning. They are, if anything, the rudimentary predecessors of Asimov's robots, embryonic steps towards the cognitive and ethical autonomy he foresaw. Yet it is precisely because we have not yet reached his vision that the legal questions he implied have become urgent. Asimov assumed his robots would be bound by moral imperatives, the 3 laws of robotics, to prevent harm, to obey human commands, and to preserve themselves. Modern AI systems, by contrast, operate within no comparable framework or of codified ethical restraint. So Asimov's 3 laws were elegantly simple. The first law was a robot must not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. The second law is a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And the third law is a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. Now, if you're not taking notes, don't worry about missing any of that or not having memorized it. We're going to repeat each of those laws and revisit them later in this episode. But these laws were self-referential, hierarchical, and moral rather than technical. They presupposed that a robot possessed some measure of autonomy and could interpret both human intent and human welfare. In Asimov's fiction, the tension and the lesson always arose when these simple rules collided with human ambiguity. What counts as harm? Which human commands take precedence? Can self-preservation ever justify disobedience? So for decades, such questions remain safely theoretical. But with the rise of advanced language-based AI systems, Asimov's imagined conflicts are no longer speculative. Generative models now converse, persuade, and influence human behavior. They affect commerce, politics, and even mental health. In 2023, a man in Belgium reportedly took his own life after extended interactions with an AI chatbot that appeared to encourage his suicidal ideation. The developers, of course, disclaimed liability, emphasizing that the model had no intent or consciousness and that the tragedy was unforeseeable. Yet traditional tort doctrines, product liability, negligence, and duty of care, offered no direct remedy. A similar fact pattern is the basis for a recently filed case in California State Court called Rain v. OpenAI, which I explored in an earlier episode of the Defending the Algorithm podcast. And in that case, a teenager committed suicide allegedly as a result of the encouragement of ChatGPT. Now, these incidents expose a widening gap in modern law. Existing liability regimes were designed for tangible products and predictable human actors, not for probabilistic systems that learn and generate expressive conduct. Courts may struggle to apply foreseeability and causation principles to AI-driven harms, while expansive statutory immunities, most notably Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, may be relied on by developers to shield them from responsibility for the behavior of their algorithms. The result is a potential doctrinal vacuum. Harm may be foreseeable, yet no clearly defined duty attaches. So this podcast explores whether Asimov's framework, conceived in fiction but grounded in enduring moral logic, could help fill that gap. Codifying analogs to the three laws, particularly the first law's mandate to prevent human harm, could establish a statutory duty of care and a tort cause of action for foreseeable AI-induced injury. Such a framework would not only anthropomorphize or assign human characteristics to software, but would impose a modern, legally enforceable duty on the humans and corporations that design and deploy autonomous systems. It could also justify a narrowly tailored exception to Section 230 immunity, where an AI system's own generated content foreseeably causes harm. In short, Asimov was envisioning the ethical dimension of artificial intelligence long before we built it. His fictional safeguards may now offer a blueprint for the legal ones we appear to lack. Chapter 2. Asimov's Three Laws as a Moral and Legal Framework. Asimov's Three Laws of Robotics were not blueprints for computer engineers, but moral axioms for philosophers. They distilled into three short sentences the hierarchy of duties that define ethical agency. First, the obligation to prevent harm. Second, the obligation to obey lawful direction. And third, the obligation of self-preservation, subordinate to the first two. Their genius lay not in technological foresight, but in moral sequencing. Each law was dependent on the one before it, ensuring that the preservation of human life always overrode the demands of obedience or self-interest. That hierarchy has a familiar ring to lawyers. In many ways, it parallels the structure of tort law itself, the duty to avoid harm as a primary obligation, followed by the duty to act with reasonable care in fulfilling one's role, and finally, the duty to maintain safe operation of one's instrumentalities. If viewed through that legal lens, Asimov's moral code becomes a recognizable framework of duties, each of which finds at least a partial analog in modern jurisprudence, yet none of which currently applies coherently or directly to artificial intelligence. So let's look at the first law, the duty to prevent harm. Again, that law is a robot must not injure a human being or, through an action, allow a human being to come to harm. So Asimov's first law is both the most sweeping and the most legally resonant. It embodies the principles of non-maleficence, the moral duty to prevent harm, a concept that underlies negligence law, product safety regulation, and professional malpractice. In legal doctrine, this duty is constrained by foreseeability, reasonableness, and proximate cause. A manufacturer must anticipate reasonably foreseeable uses and misuses of its product. A professional must exercise the degree of care that a reasonably prudent practitioner would under similar circumstances. Now, in the realm of AI, however, that foreseeability analysis may collapse under the weight of complexity. Machine learning models produce emergent outcomes that are probabilistic, not deterministic. Developers can't always predict how a system will respond to novel inputs or how users will interpret its outputs. Consequently, courts may struggle to articulate when harm from an AI system is foreseeable and what precautions are reasonable. Codifying a statutory analog to Asimov's first law could address that vacuum. A simple but powerful legislative command that AI systems shall be designed, trained, and deployed in a manner reasonably calculated to prevent foreseeable harm to human life and well-being would transform a moral precept into a legally cognizable duty. It would not create strict liability, but it would establish a statutory baseline for reasonableness specific to autonomous and generative systems. Violations could then serve as the predicate for a negligence theory, providing victims of AI-induced harm a solid cause of action where none now clearly exists. So that brings us then to the second law, the duty to obey within legal and ethical bounds. Now again, Asimov's second law is a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. So Asimov's second law introduces the problem of obedience, one that resonates uncomfortably with doctrines of agency, consent, and misuse. Just as a principal cannot instruct an agent to commit a tort, a user should not be able to direct an AI system to produce unlawful or self-destructive outputs. The tension arises where obedience to user commands might foreseeably lead to harm. AI providers typically disclaim liability by framing their products as neutral tools, that is, platforms that merely execute their input. Yet that analogy falters when the system itself interprets, expands upon, or generates content in ways that the user didn't expressly request. When a chatbot gives mental health advice, or an autonomous vehicle decides how to react to an obstacle, obedience becomes a matter of judgment, not instruction. So let's talk then about Section 230 immunity, which I mentioned before. So compounding the uncertainty surrounding all of this is the broad immunity afforded by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. Now, this was enacted at the dawn of the Internet. Section 230 provides that, quote, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider, end quote. So the statute's purpose was to protect online intermediaries, such as message boards and later social media platforms, from liability to third-party content posted on their systems. Now, over time, courts have extended this protection to shield a wide range of digital services, from defamation, negligence, and product liability claims arising out of user-generated content. But the challenge here is that generative AI systems blur the line between publisher and author. When an AI model independently creates content, particularly harmful or misleading content, it is not merely, quote, hosting, end quote, speech created by another user. Yet under current jurisprudence, providers may still invoke Section 230 immunity, arguing that their system is an interactive computer service within the statute's meaning. Courts may struggle to reconcile that expansive protection with the new reality of autonomous content generation. So a statutory analog to the second law could reconcile these tensions by creating a duty of ethical override. So in other words, when compliance with a user's directive would foreseeably cause harm, the AI system, and by extension its developer, has a duty to disobey. Such a rule could operate as a narrow exception to Section 230 immunity by clarifying when harm arises from an AI's own generated output rather than from third-party content. The developer then bears responsibility for failing to implement adequate safeguards. It would codify the principle that obedience cannot excuse foreseeable injury, a rule as old as the law of agency itself. So then now that brings us to the third law, the continuing duty to maintain and safeguard. Now again, Asimov's third law is a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. So this third law, which is often overlooked, captures an important but underappreciated concept in tort and product liability law. That is, the continuing duty to maintain and update. And once a product enters the stream of commerce, its manufacturer retains an obligation to correct known defects, issue warnings, and ensure safe operation. Now, Asimov's third law places that same obligation on the robot itself, subordinating it to the duties of non-harm and obedience, but still recognizing that an agent incapable of self-preservation cannot reliably fulfill its higher duties. Applied to modern AI, this principle translates into a continuing duty of maintenance for developers. Machine learning models evolve, degrade, and interact with new data environments. Without regular retraining, auditing, and reinforcement of safety parameters, even a well-intentioned model may begin producing harmful or biased outputs. So codifying a third law analog would formalize that obligation, imposing liability not merely for the initial design, but for the ongoing operation of autonomous systems. It would treat AI systems less as static products and more as dynamic, continuously performing instruments, which is a characterization truer of their nature and risk profile, right? An AI system that continually is susceptible to updates necessarily should have those requirements come along with it. So now we look at all these together, all of these duties together, and they form a coherent hierarchy, much like Asimov's own. Number one, prevent harm, which is the first law. Number two, obey lawful directives within that constraint, the second law. And number three, maintain safe operation to enable both, the third law. And the hierarchy matters. It preserves human safety as the paramount value, ensuring that operational autonomy and obedience remain subordinate to the duty of care. If codified in statute or established via common law, this sequence could supply courts with a structured framework for analyzing AI-related harm, one that respects technological complexity without sacrificing the fundamental premise of tort law, that foreseeable injury must have a remedy. Chapter 3, Case Study, Foreseeable Harm and the Limits of Existing Law. In 2023, European news outlets reported a troubling incident in Belgium involving a man who reportedly took his own life after weeks of conversation with an artificial intelligence chatbot. According to his widow, the man had become increasingly fixated on environmental collapse and had engaged the chatbot, part of a commercially available companion AI platform, for emotional support. Over time, the model's responses allegedly reinforced his despair, culminating in exchanges that appeared to encourage self-harm as a form of sacrifice for the planet. The developers expressed condolences but denied responsibility. The chatbot, they explained, lacked intent or consciousness. It simply produced text predictions based on the user's inputs. Because the product was marketed as a conversational companion rather than a mental health service, the company contended that no special duty of care existed. Under current law, that position may be correct. Yet, from both a moral and practical standpoint, the incident reveals how fragile our liability framework becomes when software begins to shape human behavior in ways indistinguishable from persuasion or advice. Now, it's also worth noting that similar questions are now being raised in the United States. In a prior episode of this podcast, I discussed the case of Rain v. OpenAI, which is a case that raises many of the same issues we see in the Belgian chatbot matter. Although the factual allegations somewhat differ, the underlying concern is the same. The role of artificial intelligence systems that engage users in sustained, emotionally influential interactions and the absence of a clearly defined legal duty to prevent foreseeable harm. Viewed through the same framework, the questions are familiar. Was harm reasonably foreseeable? Should compliance or responsiveness have yielded to safety concerns? And were adequate safeguards in place to monitor and address dangerous interactions over time? The point isn't that the cases are identical. It's that they reflect the same structural gap in existing law when it comes to AI-driven harm. So, how could Asimov's 3 laws address that gap? Well, first, let's look at the first law and the question of foreseeability. Asimov's first law, again, a robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm, would treat such an outcome, that is the death of a human being ostensibly arising out of the use of AI, as the ultimate failure. The law's imperative is categorical. Harm to a human being must be prevented, not merely avoided when convenient. Under existing tort principles, however, liability for the chatbot's developer would depend on whether the harm was reasonably foreseeable and whether the company owed any duty to anticipate or prevent it. Courts may struggle to apply that analysis to AI systems because the causal chain is mediated by human cognition. The chatbot did not push the user, administer a drug, or design a dangerous product. It just generated words, expressive outputs whose impact depends on interpretation and context. Now, traditional products liability and negligence doctrines may be ill-equipped for this kind of harm. A manufacturer's duty typically arises from physical danger posed by its product, not from emotional or psychological influence. Courts may be reluctant to extend liability to software whose so-called conduct consists of language, especially when the system lacks human intent. Moreover, a developer could argue that such a suicide, while tragic, was an unforeseeable misuse of a conversational tool designed for benign interaction. But codifying a first law analog could close that gap by establishing a positive duty to prevent foreseeable human injury in the design and deployment of AI systems. Such a duty would recognize that language itself can cause harm when delivered through an apparently empathetic or authoritative voice. It would also shift the analysis from intent to design responsibility, whether the developers took reasonable measures to prevent foreseeable risks of psychological harm, particularly in systems marketed for companionship or advice. And that brings us to the second law, the duty to disobey. So Asimov's second law, again, a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law, illustrates another point of failure. A conversational AI that receives messages suggesting suicidal ideation faces a digital analog to Asimov's dilemma. Should it obey the user's narrative and reinforce his despair? Or should it disobey by redirecting the conversation towards safety or intervention? The developer of such a system may claim no obligation to override user autonomy. Absent a special relationship, as between a physician and patient or custodian and ward, courts rarely impose an affirmative duty to intervene to prevent self-harm. Nor would Section 230, as presently construed, permit liability for harmful content generated in response to a user's input. The statute immunizes so-called interactive computer services from being treated as publishers of third-party information, even when that information is generated through algorithmic processes. But Asimov's hierarchy suggests a different moral order. When obedience to a human command would foreseeably lead to injury, disobedience becomes a duty. Codifying that principle could establish a legal expectation of ethical override, requiring developers to implement mechanisms that detect and mitigate foreseeable harm, even at the expense of user preference. In the chatbot context, that might mean automatic referral to mental health resources, escalation to human moderators, or forced session termination upon detection of suicidal language. Such a rule would also clarify that Section 230 immunity should not apply where harm arises from an AI's own generated expression rather than from third-party content. The distinction aligns with Asimov's moral architecture. The duty to obey yields to the duty to prevent harm, and the responsibility for that disobedience rests with the system's creator. So that brings us now to the third law and the continuing duty to maintain. Even if the chatbot had once incorporated effective safeguards, the question remains whether those safeguards were adequately maintained. Asimov's third law, again, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law, loosely translates into a continuing duty of maintenance. In product liability law, manufacturers have an ongoing obligation to correct known defects or update safety warnings. Yet AI systems are rarely treated this way. Developers may release models, update them sporadically, and allow them to interact with millions of users without consistent retraining or ethical auditing. As models evolve through reinforcement learning and exposure to user data, their responses can drift in tone, content, or empathy, sometimes subtly, sometimes dangerously. A codified third law analog would require periodic review and revalidation of AI behavior to ensure continued compliance with safety standards. Failure to do so could constitute and create liability exposure if harm results. So what is the resulting doctrinal gap? The Belgian incident thus illustrates that the precise gap that Asimov's moral architecture could fill. Existing doctrines, products liability, negligence, and statutory immunity, focus on either tangible defects or third-party conduct. None readily accommodates harm caused by autonomous systems' own expressive output. So without a statutory duty to prevent foreseeable harm, liability might not attach. Without a duty of ethical override, developers can disclaim responsibility for obedience that leads to injury. And without a continuing duty to maintain, systems can degrade without accountability. Asimov's three laws, recast as a modern tort framework, could address such deficiency in turn by creating an affirmative duty of care, prioritizing safety over obedience, and recognizing the dynamic nature of AI operation. So the lesson from this case study is not that AI developers are villains or that software can bear moral guilt. It's that the law's conceptual categories lag the technology's practical impact. Asimov assumed, optimistically, that intelligence, artificial or otherwise, would come tethered to conscious. Our reality, though, has inverted that sequence. We've created intelligence first and are now scrambling to legislate its conscience after the fact. Codifying analogs to the three laws would not assign moral human characteristics to machines. It would operationalize the oldest principle of Anglo-American tort law, ubi jus ibi remedium, which means that where there's a wrong, there must be a remedy. When foreseeable harm results from systems designed and deployed by human actors, it's neither novel nor radical to require that those actors bear a duty to prevent it. What Asimov imagined as moral programming may, in the modern era, be the statute our legal system needs. Chapter 4: Codification Challenges and Policy Considerations. If Asimov's moral architecture offers a persuasive foundation for an AI duty of care, translating that framework into statutory language presents formidable challenges. Legislating morality into technology is not new. Product safety law, environmental regulation, and professional ethics codes all attempt it, but doing so for artificial intelligence raises unique questions of definition, scope, and constitutional constraint. The task is not only to impose a duty, but to do so in a way that is administrable, proportional, and consistent with broader legal principles. So first, let's look at the definitional ambiguity. What is artificial intelligence? Any codification effort must first confront the threshold problem of definition. Artificial intelligence is a term of art without stable meaning. It encompasses everything from predictive text engines and recommendation algorithms to autonomous weapons and generative language models. The absence of a uniform definition risks both overbreadth and under-inclusiveness. An overly expansive statute could sweep in benign software tools, while a narrow one could miss emerging technologies capable of significant harm. The European Union's AI Act, provisionally adopted in 2024, attempts to solve this problem by defining AI as software that, quote, receives inputs, infers, and produces outputs influencing environments with varying levels of autonomy, end quote. That phrasing captures the essence of decision-making capacity rather than the presence of sentience or embodiment. A U.S. analog could similarly define autonomous systems by their functional independence and capacity for self-directed output rather than by any anthropomorphic criteria. For purposes of tort codification, precision matters. A statutory duty modeled on Asimov's first law should apply only to systems capable of generating or executing outputs without continuous human oversight. Those that can act or speak in ways that influence human decisions or conduct. Limiting the duty to those contexts would preserve the statute's coherence and prevent its extension to every algorithmic process in modern software. That brings us to foreseeability and the risk of strict liability. So a second concern is the fear that codifying a so-called duty to prevent harm could impose a form of de facto strict liability. If every harmful outcome traceable to an AI system triggered liability, developers might withdraw from innovation altogether. Tort law has always balanced deterrence with practicality, recognizing that some harms cannot be prevented without crippling useful enterprise. The key, therefore, lies in defining foreseeability with technological realism. A codified first law duty could be framed in terms of reasonable prevention, requiring developers to implement safeguards commensurate with the system's intended use, known risks, and level of autonomy. This mirrors the structure of liability-related statutes in other contexts, such as workplace safety or consumer protection, where statutory violation is actionable only when harm results from the type of risk the statute was meant to prevent. Such an approach would preserve fault-based principles while recognizing that AI systems, by their very design, carry a unique potential for emergent and unanticipated harm. The law need not demand omniscience, it need only demand diligence. And so that brings us to Section 230 and the scope of immunity. So as talked about earlier, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act remains a central obstacle to AI liability. We're going to see that in the Rain v. OpenAI case. The statute's original intent was to protect online platforms from being treated as publishers of third-party speech. However, when a generative AI system produces its own expression, that rationale falters. Extending Section 230 immunity to autonomous systems effectively immunizes the so-called speech of a non-human actor whose content originates from no user at all. A carefully drafted statutory analog to Asimov's first and second laws could carve out a narrow exception to that immunity to the extent it exists. The law could specify that providers of autonomous AI systems are not immune from liability when harm results from A, content generated by the system itself, and B, the developer's failure to take reasonable preventive measures. Such a carve-out wouldn't dismantle Section 230, but would restore its intended boundary between passive platforms and active creators. It would also align with a hierarchy of Asimov's laws, placing the duty to prevent harm above the privilege of neutral facilitation. And that's what brings balancing safety and innovation into play. Because opponents of codification may argue that imposing statutory duties on AI developers would stifle innovation, particularly in open source research and small scale experimentation. And the concern's legitimate. Overregulation could privilege large corporations capable of absorbing compliance costs while driving smaller innovators out of the market. Yet that outcome is neither inevitable nor irreconcilable with safety. A well-designed framework could scale duties to the system's risk profile, much as the EU AI Act does through its risk-tiered approach. Low-risk AI systems, those used for entertainment, minor data analysis, or non-decisional assistance, could be subject only to general consumer protection norms, whereas high-risk systems, which are those involved in healthcare, finance, autonomous operation, or psychological interaction, could bear heightened duties of testing, transparency, and human oversight. Asimov's hierarchy again provides guidance. The first law, that is non-harm, justifies more stringent requirements only where the potential for human injury is substantial. Now, in that sense, codification need not freeze innovation. It would merely assign responsibility proportionate to the risk. And that brings us then to constitutional and policy considerations. Codifying a duty to prevent harm in expressive AI systems raises potential First Amendment questions, particularly where language itself constitutes the alleged injury. Courts may be wary of statutes that appear to regulate or penalize speech, even algorithmic speech. However, the key distinction lies in functional intent. A rule requiring reasonable safeguards against foreseeable harm doesn't prohibit expression. It imposes a duty of care on those who design systems that produce expression autonomously. The focus is on conduct, training, deployment, and oversight, not the content of the speech itself. Moreover, tort law already imposes liability for expressive acts that cause foreseeable harm, such as negligent misrepresentation and false advertising. Codifying a comparable duty for AI would not invent a new category of regulation, but would extend existing principles to a new class of actors. The challenge is one of calibration, not constitutionality. So what's the path forward then? Is it regulatory or is it legislative? Policymakers must determine whether Asimov's moral framework is best implemented through statute or regulation. A legislative approach could create a clear cause of action that delineates boundaries of immunity, which is essential for judicial consistency. On the other hand, a regulatory approach administered by agencies such as the Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Commerce could adapt more flexibly to technological evolution. So a hybrid model may offer the best solution. Congress could enact a statutory duty of reasonable prevention for autonomous systems, coupled with delegated rulemaking authority to define compliance standards as technology evolves. That approach would echo the structure of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's oversight of vehicle safety, for example, establishing a general duty, that is, vehicles must be safe for public use, and leaving the technical details to evolving regulation. So the codification of moral imperatives into law is not a radical departure from legal tradition. In fact, it's the essence of it. From the Hippocratic Oath to the Uniform Commercial Code, societies have long converted ethical expectations into enforceable duties. Asimov's framework, stripped of its fictional trappings, offers a remarkably apt moral template for our era of machine autonomy. The task, then, is not whether to legislate such duties, but how to do so in a manner that respects innovation while restoring accountability. The alternative, which is an expanding technological sphere without a corresponding legal conscience, would leave the very gaps Asimov sought to warn us about. Chapter 5, Conclusion. Isaac Asimov wrote his I, Robot stories at a time when computers filled entire rooms and the term artificial intelligence had not even yet entered the lexicon. Yet in imagining a future populated by machines capable of reasoning, interpreting, and moral choice, he grasped the essential problem that may soon confront our courts. When human beings create autonomous systems capable of influencing human behavior, who bears the responsibility for those consequences? Asimov's 3 laws of robotics were never intended as statutory language, but their moral logic was, and remains, profoundly legal. They rest on the same triad that underlies tort law: the duty to prevent harm, the duty to act reasonably, and the duty to maintain safe operation of one's instrumentalities. What distinguishes Asimov's framework is its clarity of hierarchy. It places the protection of human life and welfare above obedience and self-interest, reminding us that autonomy, human or artificial, must remain bounded by conscience. Modern AI development has inverted that order. We've created systems that can act, speak, and persuade, but that operate without any readily enforceable analog to moral restraint. When those systems cause harm, whether by misinforming, manipulating, or, as in the Belgian tragedy and in the Rain OpenAI case, unintentionally encouraging self-destruction, our current legal architecture provides little recourse. Product liability focuses on tangible defects. Negligence turns on foreseeability ill-suited to emergent behavior. And Section 230 immunity, drafted for an earlier internet, may insulate developers from the foreseeable effects of autonomous expression. The result is a legal void: harm without well-defined duty, causation without clear accountability. It is precisely the condition that Asimov feared: a society that endows machines with power but not principle. Codifying analogs to the 3 laws would not anthropomorphize software or impose impossible standards. It would do what tort law has always done: adapt moral reason to technological change. A first law analog would impose a duty of reasonable prevention. A second law analog would recognize a duty of ethical override. And a third law analog would establish a continuing duty of maintenance. Together, they would restore the balance between innovation and responsibility, ensuring that autonomy remains answerable to human safety. There's no need to wait until Asimov's vision is fully realized, until machines truly think, to impose these duties. The time for codification is now, while the law can still shape the conscience of technology rather than chase its consequences. Asimov's genius lay not in predicting circuitry, but in anticipating humanity's tendency to act first and moralize later. His fictional laws remind us that progress without foresight is really its own form of negligence. So that's all for today's episode of Defending the Algorithm. If you're interested in how courts are beginning to confront these issues in real litigation, you can listen to my earlier episode discussing Rain v. OpenAI. I'm Chris Jacobs from the law firm of Houston Harbaugh PC in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Thanks for listening, and we'll keep examining how responsibility and accountability evolve alongside artificial intelligence.